Hello, and welcome to People of the Pod, brought to you by American Jewish Committee. Each week, we take you beyond the headlines to help you understand what they all mean for America, Israel, and the Jewish people. I'm your host, Manya Brashear-Pashman. World leaders convened at the United Nations this week to open the 79th session of the General Assembly. Every year, AJC experts lead the Jewish community's diplomatic outreach on issues ranging from confronting anti-Israel bias and antisemitism to uniting the world against the Iranian threat. This year's meetings come amid a backdrop of Israel's seven-front defensive war against Iran and its terror proxies, and the surge of antisemitism since Hamas's October 7th attacks on Israel. Here to discuss the priorities on the sidelines of this year's UN General Assembly is Jason Isaacson, AJC's Chief Policy and Political Affairs Officer. Jason, welcome to People of the Pod.
Thank you, Manya. It's good to be here.
So I want to turn first to Israel's defensive military operations in Lebanon, targeting Hezbollah. For years, AJC has been pushing the UN to designate all of Hezbollah a terrorist organization. How does Hezbollah's near daily attacks on Israel and this military operation change that plea?
I mean, it changes it only in that it emphasizes, once again, its demonstration of the danger posed by Hezbollah, which, of course, is a threat to the security, the safety of the people of Israel, to peace across the region. But also Hezbollah has arms, tentacles that reach elsewhere, reach into Europe for fundraising purposes, for narcotics trafficking, for money laundering, posing a real threat to security, not just for the people of Israel, but for people elsewhere in the world. But what's been happening since October 8th, when Hezbollah started firing rockets, missiles, anti-tank weapons into northern Israel, killing Israelis, civilians and soldiers, destroying property, inflaming the region, unprovoked, but they did it in response to or as an ally of Hamas, another Iranian-backed terror organization, has just destabilized the region, made it impossible for tens of thousands of Israelis to live in their homes. They've had to evacuate the north, disrupting the personal lives of so many. And now, of course, over the last week or 2 weeks, we've seen repeated huge barrages of rockets, missiles that have been fired into Israel, killing and destroying property. And it's intolerable. Israel cannot live with that kind of a threat on its border. And no country would tolerate this. Israel will not tolerate it. And so we're seeing decisive action in various ways that Israel has responded to these multiple threats. In the case of Lebanon, we've seen missile attacks on rocket launchers and command centers and commanders. Very precise, targeted. Of course, it is war, and there has been collateral damage, and that is terrible. But Israel has been attacked relentlessly, ruthlessly by Hezbollah. It must respond. We've also seen very interesting, really quite clever use of technologies that Israel has mastered in other ways to attack Hezbollah commanders and fighters. We are hopeful that this will send a very clear message to Hezbollah leadership and to their backers in Tehran that they really have to pull this back. There does not have to be a wider war in the region. It is really Hezbollah's decision, Iran's decision, whether to return to some state of calm where we can have the people of Israel return to their homes, the people of southern Lebanon return to their homes, and get back to kind of normal life.
Do the diplomats you are encountering on the sidelines of the UN understand that? Do they acknowledge what you just said?
The word on the lips of most diplomats is de-escalate, avoid a wider war. And of course, we can all appreciate that. No one wants a wider war. But what is a country to do that is being attacked daily by hundreds of rockets and missiles fired into cities and towns? It cannot just simply say, oh, well, we're just going to restrain ourselves because, we're more moral than our terrorist neighbors. No country would do that. No country could make that decision. So, yes, there is understanding of the situation that Israel's in. There is an appeal for lessening the tensions, for de-escalating. But I think that privately, it is widely understood that Israel has no choice but to defeat the terrorist enemies that are at its throat.
I spoke of the call to designate Hezbollah a terror organization in its entirety. Does Hamas need to be added to that plea for designation, or do most diplomats already, or I should say, do most countries already recognize Hamas as a terror organization?
Unfortunately, most countries do not already recognize Hezbollah as a terrorist organization, at least not formally. I mean, they may do it sort of rhetorically, and in a meeting with us, they may say that they, of course, recognize that, but for reasons that they will cite having to do with their need to continue to interact with the government of Lebanon, which, of course, has a very strong Hezbollah component in that government, they don't want to box themselves out of some kind of interaction with Beirut. We could point out, as we do repeatedly, that it's not necessary to exclude contact with Lebanese authorities by designating Hezbollah as a terrorist organization. Other countries find ways around that problem. France and others that have cited this argument to us repeatedly could do so as well. But it's important that Hezbollah be designated as a terrorist organization. It's also important that the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps of Iran also be designated fully as a terrorist organization. Of course, the United States has done that. A number of other countries have as well. But that must be universal. It is so clear who is lighting the fires across the region, who is threatening the sovereignty, the security of a neighboring state. And for countries to not take those simple steps to try to clamp down on funding, on money transfers, on freedom of movement internationally for leaders of the IRGC, for leaders of Hezbollah, is just turning a blind eye to terrorism. That's not tolerable.
What about Hamas? Has that been designated by more countries as a terror organization than Hezbollah or the IRGC?
Hamas is widely recognized as a terrorist organization, and I think that we need to press the countries that have not yet done so to add Hamas to the terror list. But we also have to not neglect the most important part of this equation, which is, of course, the support that Hamas and that Hezbollah get from Iran. And the fact that the sanctions that have been imposed on Iran are not always widely and carefully and universally enforced. The fact that Iran has been freed from certain restrictions that the UN imposed after the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action in 2015 in terms of its missile development. A lot of sanctions have to be restored, and the sanctions, particularly on the missile program of Iran, should be restored. And the United States, in the next administration, whether it is a Harris administration or a Trump administration, I'm expecting a whole new playbook regarding the approach to Iran.
So the October 7th attacks, which happened shortly after last year's General Assembly, killed more than 1,200 people. 101 hostages still remain in captivity. Has the UN adequately condemned Hamas for the October 7th atrocities, the recent murder of 6 hostages, and has it called for the unconditional release of the remaining hostages?
No, frankly, the UN response has been disappointing, to say the least. It has failed repeatedly when efforts have been made to condemn Hamas specifically, even though we know that it is understood across the board, around the world, the terrorist nature of the threat that Israel faces. No one doubts, if you have a conversation with a diplomat, that Hamas was responsible for the most horrific atrocities on October 7th and since, and of course is holding 101 hostages, some of whom are not alive, but those who are in the most brutal conditions. We saw what happened just a few weeks ago when Israel was preparing to actually liberate 6 hostages, including one American-Israeli, and they were executed before the Israeli soldiers could get to them by Hamas. Everyone knows the culpability of Hamas, and yet there has been a moral failure on the part of the United Nations to condemn Hamas. There have been a number of General Assembly and Security Council efforts to raise the issue of the hostages, to raise the issue of Hamas, and they've been deflected. They have not been allowed to move forward. There have been, of course, continual condemnations, as the United Nations has a long history of condemning Israel for its occupation of Palestinian territory, for its treatment of Palestinian civilians. That happens, ritually in the United Nations. And of course, every year in the General Assembly, there are, a dozen or 20 or so resolutions against Israel. But to call out the terrorist organization that killed 1,200 people and captured 251 others, men, women, children, grandparents, and has been holding 100 plus still in captivity in Gaza, that just isn't quite on the UN's agenda. It's very disappointing. That's more than disappointing. It's outrageous.
You did mention that targeting Iran or just recognizing that Iran is pulling the strings on all of this. with its nuclear ambitions, its advanced missile program, these proxy armies and terror organizations, the regime does seem to pose a profound danger to Israel, as well as the broader world. But do members of the UN seem to recognize this? And what is AJC pushing them to do about it?
There is wide recognition, certainly in the Gulf, but also increasingly in Europe, of the danger posed by Iran, not only on the nuclear file, where Iran is inching closer and closer to being a nuclear threshold state, if not an actual nuclear weapon state, but also the Iranian support for subversion, for terrorism in countries across the region, Iranian regime support for assassination attempts and kidnapping attempts across Europe, in the United States as well. Former Secretary of State of the United States, a former National Security Advisor of the United States, under protection by the U.S. government because of those Iranian threats, and in Europe as well. This is recognized. Whether countries are prepared to impose some economic hardship on their own countries because of imposing sanctions on trade with Iran is another question. It's sometimes been difficult for countries to make that decision. We have been pushing countries to impose further sanctions on trade with Iran, on the missile program that Iran has been pursuing, on Iran's collaboration with Russia in Russia's brutal war of aggression in Ukraine, which is really getting the attention, especially of European leaders. So we have a lot of arguments that we've been deploying in our meetings over the last week and beyond the last week with the leaders around the world, but especially with European leaders, to get much tougher in their dealings with Iran, to stop Iran Air from flying into Europe, which is now an action that is moving forward, but other forms of interaction, just to make it impossible for the Iranian regime to continue to carry out its aggression in the region, threatening the security of countries in the Gulf, but of course threatening Israel in multiple ways by supporting terrorists who are acting against the Israeli people on 7 fronts. We are hoping, and we are working hard through our advocacy in the United States, at the United Nations, around the world, with our 15 offices across the globe, to make that case to foreign governments that it is time to call out and to act firmly against Iranian aggression.
I'm so glad you mentioned Russia, because I did want to ask you whether Ukraine is still a priority, whether it's still a priority for AJC, but also whether it's still a priority for the UN. It's been more than 2 years.
In AJC's meetings on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly this week, we have repeatedly made the case that the territorial integrity of Ukraine, democracy in Ukraine, and frankly, the territorial integrity and democracy and security of Europe as a whole is at stake in the war that Russia is pursuing, that Vladimir Putin has launched against Ukraine, its neighbor. The importance of the United States and our allies continuing to supply Ukraine with the means to defend itself. We're not talking about American boots on the ground in Ukraine. We're talking about America doing whatever it can, and it has done a lot to help the people of Ukraine defend themselves against Russian aggression, not only for the good of Ukraine, but frankly for the security, the safety of Europe, and frankly of global security. If Russia is allowed to continue gobbling up pieces of Ukrainian territory unimpeded, unchallenged by the West, it will continue its rapacious ways, and that is just not acceptable. In Europe, it's not acceptable for security of the United States, for our interests across the world. So it is important that Russia be pushed back. It is important that we stand by Ukraine as they try to liberate themselves from Russian aggression. And frankly, it's a signal to other countries that may have territorial ambitions, designs on neighboring states, small, weaker states. You know what we're talking about here. So it's important that the line be drawn, and we stand by that line and continue to supply Ukraine with what it needs to defend itself. And it has actually made some impressive gains. It has still a challenge ahead. Russia's much larger and has many more missiles in its stockpile than Ukraine does. But Ukraine is fighting back and is actually taking the fight to Russia, which is so important. We need to stand by our friends in Ukraine as they beat back Putin's aggression.
So that seems to be a popular sentiment, that it's okay for Ukraine to fight back, and we support that effort. So why do they not support the efforts of Israel to fight back? Is it just geography?
Well, Israel has always had a difficult challenge in the United Nations, of course. The situation with the Palestinians has been a popular cause across the globe, and it's been very difficult for Israel to make the case that it does not want to rule over the Palestinian people. It was put in that position as a result of a war in which it defended itself against aggression in 67 and 73 and ended up occupying land or administering land that had been launching pads for strikes against the people of Israel themselves. It is hoping for, searching for. It has signed on to a process that would allow for a political resolution of the status of the Palestinians. Palestinian leadership has been such that it hasn't been able to move forward on any kind of a further settlement of that dispute with Israel. And in the meantime, the public around the world has grown frustrated and, of course, has a continuing support for the underdog. Less appreciation for the situation that Israel finds itself in, and that's just a fact of life that we've been wrestling with for too long. At the same time, there is an appreciation of the contributions that Israel has made and continues to make to technological advancement, public health, a variety of fields in which certainly the countries in the region, but countries beyond the region can benefit from further interaction with Israel. We've seen the growth of the relationship between Israel and India, the growth of the relationship between India and other states in the developing world. And we're hoping that at a certain point, public opinion will follow the trend that is so evident in our contacts with governments around the world. In many ways, what we've seen is an action in which Israel is the target, but the real target is the West. The real target is the United States. And Israel as an ally of the United States, as the one democracy in the Middle East closely connected to the United States, has been in many ways the focal point for antagonism toward the West. And it puts Israel in a unique position, sort of a positive position in some ways, in that there's an affiliation, an association of Israel with the United States, which is of benefit to countries in the region that want their own strategic partnership with the United States, that want to benefit from Israel's access to the West technologically, in education, in public health, in a whole range of sectors. But for other parts of the world where it's easy to blame the West for their own economic situation or political situation, it's very easy to link the United States with Israel and therefore to hold Israel somewhat to a different, harsher standard. That's part of what's going on. Part of it is identification with the Palestinian cause, which has been very popular on the street, fueled in the Arab world by Al Jazeera and other media, but also very conveniently used over the generations by Arab governments to deflect from their own issues of governance in their own countries. And elsewhere in the world, it's been a rallying cry for a range of despots and dictators and monarchs who have wanted to, again, distract their countries from the real issues that they face and target this Western outpost in the Eastern Mediterranean.
Speaking of strategic partnerships, is the UN General Assembly the right forum to pursue discussions of expanding the Abraham Accords? And is this the right time, even if it is the right forum?
Well, in the General Assembly of the United Nations, no, because there is an automatic majority. And we just saw this on display just a week or so ago when the UN General Assembly adopted a one-sided anti-Israel resolution overwhelmingly by something like 50% more votes against Israel than occurred the last time, a couple of years ago, that there was a resolution regarding Israel in the General Assembly, a similar resolution. So no, not in the General Assembly itself, not in the UN system itself, but among individual countries, Israel is still quite popular at elite levels of many countries. And AJC has worked, I should say, tirelessly for decades to open doors for Israel, countries around the world, not just in the Arab world, but in the developing world and elsewhere. We continue to do so, and we continue to find great receptivity to the argument that there is much to be gained by a relationship with Israel, maybe starting out quietly, but benefiting the people of your country, Prime Minister, Foreign Minister, Mr. President, Madam President. These are arguments that we are making constantly, and we're seeing the openings of trade relations, of new business opportunities, investments, exchanges, people coming to Israel to learn about how they can benefit their own societies by a different kind of a partnership with counterparts in Israel. AJC has been part of that action for a long time. We continue to do so through our Center for a New Middle East, which was announced by AJC CEO Ted Deutsch in June. We are expanding our efforts, especially across the Gulf and North Africa, to introduce societies, civil sector leaders, business people, and governments to the benefits that would accrue to them, to their societies, through the embrace of this new Middle East, which has begun, frankly, with the Abraham Accords in 2020. And we are hopeful that the coming years will bring us greater success as well, but not just in that part of the world. Other countries, as we have seen through the advent of I2U2 and IMEC, which were efforts to bring India into more interaction with Israel and with Europe, this corridor from India to the Middle East to Europe, and Israel in cooperation with India and the United States and the United Arab Emirates, I2U2. All of these efforts are efforts to expand the circle of Arab-Israeli peace, to expand the circle of Israel's interaction with, for the benefit of those countries around the world. And we're seeing great success there. We continue to work hard to broaden that success.
Jason, thank you so much for shedding light on what you've been up to this week on the sidelines.
Always a pleasure, Manya. Thank you.
Thank you for listening. This episode is brought to you by AJC. Our producer is Atara Lakritz. Our sound engineer is TK Broderick. You can subscribe to People of the Pod on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or Google Podcasts, or learn more at ajc.org/peopleofthepod. The views and opinions of our guests don't necessarily reflect the positions of AJC. We'd love to hear your views and opinions or your questions. You can reach us at peopleofthepod@ajc.org. If you've enjoyed this episode, please be sure to tell your friends, tag us on social media with #PeopleOfThePod, and hop on to Apple Podcasts to rate us and write a review to help more listeners find us. Tune in next week for another episode of People of the Pod.